Hey everybody, thank you so much for hanging out with us this weekend, for inviting us into your home, into your micro church, wherever it is, however it is you're watching. Thank you so much for being here. This week, we're excited. We're starting a brand new series. We're going to spend the next several weeks talking about the idea of power. Now, power is kind of an interesting term because it's hard to define. Typically, when we talk about power, we're referring to some kind of authority or control. There's a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber who defined power as the ability to exercise one's will over another. Now, a lot of times when we talk about power, we use it to refer to like military type strength. But what's interesting is you can also see power at play in some non-violent movements throughout history, including those led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. or Gandhi. And power is this kind of interesting dynamic in that it's really all around us and it's a part of all of our everyday lives. So many of the struggles that we have in our life and in the world around us are related to power dynamics, people struggling for power. I mean, think for a minute just about your own personal life. A lot of times within families, within family units, there's power struggles between maybe the mom and the dad, the husband and the wife, for who's really in charge, who's really in control. As families grow, a lot of times there becomes power dynamics between parents and between children. Now, those power dynamics are often amplified when children get into teenage years, because in teenage years, is when you start this idea of becoming your own independent person. And so there's a little bit of wanting to exercise your own power, but then there's parents trying to kind of hold on to their power and their authority while they can. And so it creates all these interesting dynamics. Even as we get older, those dynamics don't change. Some of us still, even as grown adults, we still have power struggles with our parents, even though like we're grown adults and we have our own families. So you see these struggles for power, they happen all around us. And really, you see them too, and politics is obviously a place that you see them. You know, you have political parties in every kind of government that are vying for power, and the reason that they want power is because they want to shape their society and their culture the way that they want it to be. Now, one interesting thing about power in the world that you and I live in is the internet and social media. That's kind of flipping the idea of power completely upside down. I mean, we saw that just a couple of weeks ago when there was that whole stock market GameStop thing. I mean, that was this crazy thing of, you know, who's really in control. And you have these people that were seemingly powerless that were influencing kind of these major financial realities of our country. And so all around us, we have these different struggles for power and who has it and who wants it. But regardless of however someone or some entity, however power is gained, and ultimately however power is exercised, it impacts us. It impacts us again in our personal life, in our families, in our relationships. It impacts us, you know, just locally with city leadership and things like that. It impacts us on a national level. It even impacts us globally. Now, Christianity and the church has an interesting history with power. And so what I want to do today as we begin this new series on power is I want us to kind of do just kind of a quick overview of the history of Christianity, the history of the church with power. Because I think this will really help us as we get into talking about the next few weeks about how power is used and how it's exercised. But I want to kind of lay the groundwork. So we're going to cover a lot of information today, and if you don't get it all, that's totally okay. The point is not that we understand every specific detail and every specific date and name that I'm going to share today. The point is I want us to understand what the history of the church is and what the history of Christianity is with power. And at the end, we're going to talk a little bit about how that should change the way you and I think and act and live if we really are trying to be followers of Jesus. Now, when you read through the Gospels, which are the first 4 books in the New Testament that tell us about the life of Jesus, it seems like Jesus is constantly surrounded by large groups of people. But what's interesting is after his death and resurrection, the number of actual committed followers is a lot smaller than that. According to the book of Acts, which is a book in the New Testament that tells us the story of the early church, according to Acts, after Jesus' resurrection, there's only about 120 followers of Jesus. So you had all these crowds of people that were just kind of fans. They wanted to see, you know, what he was going to do and what he was going to say and what it was all about. But according to Acts, there's only like 120 that are actual followers of Jesus, committed to following him. Now, also in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul writes a letter to the church in Corinth, and in that letter, he talks about 500 people who can serve as witnesses to the resurrected Jesus. As he's writing them, he says, hey, if you don't believe Jesus rose again, here's 500 people you could talk to that saw him. So these are two numbers we get out of the Old Testament. And granted, those two things are at least a couple years apart, but however big, whatever the exact amount of followers of Jesus is. What we know is from the beginning, it's less than 1,000. I mean, again, whether it's 120, whether it's 500, whether it grows from there, the church, Christianity as we know it, starts out with this very small group of people. Now, when Christianity begins, it's not even really its own separate movement. It wasn't even classified as like a different religion. It starts as a subgroup within Judaism because Jesus was a devout Jew. His closest followers during his life were devout Jews. Even after Jesus' death and resurrection, after he ascends into heaven, promising to return one day, the church is still centered around the temple in Jerusalem. They live very Jewish lives. They follow Jewish laws. They just happen to believe that Jesus is God in the flesh and that he died and rose again. But it's seen as this like subgroup within Judaism. But what happens is as the church begins to grow, people begin to realize, hey, wait a minute, this isn't the same thing. This is different. These people may do a lot of things that Jews do, but this is a very different thing. Now, the first group to recognize that are the Jews themselves. The Jews begin to realize that, hey, here's this like movement within the umbrella of Judaism that they're not like us. They're different. They believe different. They think different. And so in the book of Acts, Stephen is a guy who becomes the first Christian martyr. He's killed. And at his martyrdom, at his death, that kind of sparks this persecution against the Christians at that time. They're not called Christians at that time, but against the followers of Jesus at that time by the power brokers within first century Judaism. Acts 8, 1-4 says this. It says, on that day, this is the day that Stephen's killed. On that day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, because again, that's where they're centered. And all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. Going from house to house, he dragged off both men and women and put them in prison. Those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. And so starting with Stephen's death, it launches this fairly intense persecution with one aim, and the aim is to get rid of the followers of Jesus, to wipe out the church, to just be done with it. And this guy named Saul is the guy that's heading it up. Saul's the one that's going all over the place from house to house, and if anyone is accused as being a follower of Jesus, then they're thrown in jail or possibly even worse. It goes on in Acts 9 verse 1 and says this, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. So Paul again is getting more authority and Saul is getting more authority and more permission to go on this mission to exterminate the church, to get rid of all these followers of Jesus. And what's interesting is we're told at this point that this group of followers of Jesus is referred to as the Way. So at this point now they have their own name. Again, before this, they didn't have a name. They were just part of Judaism. But now the Jewish people are recognizing, no, these people are different. They're not like us. So this is the first point where the church actually has its own name. It's referred to as the Way, which could refer to, the way of God, because that's what they said that they were following, the way of Jesus, the way of salvation, the way of life, whatever it is. But this is how these early followers of Jesus, this is the first name that's given to them. They're referred to as the Way. Now, on this particular mission where Saul is going out trying to destroy the Way, he has this incredible encounter with Jesus. You can read all about it in the book of Acts. He's knocked, off his horse, falls on the ground. He's blind for a few days. He gets healed. But he has this incredible experience with Jesus, and it changes his life forever. First of all, it changes his name. This is when his name is changed from Saul to Paul. And he goes from being the number one enemy of the church to being the person who's really kind of accelerates its growth and its expansion all over the Roman Empire. Paul's a guy who will lead the church out to cover all throughout the Roman Empire. And this all happens, Saul to Paul has this conversion right about the year 35 CE is about when it happens. Now, ultimately, Paul will end up at a church called Antioch. And Antioch, in a lot of ways, becomes the center of Christianity. Antioch is the first church. Antioch is just north of Israel and Syria. Antioch is the first church to ever send out missionaries. But Antioch's also the place where followers of Jesus are first referred to as Christians. Acts 11:26 says this, the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. So Antioch is the first place that the word Christian shows up. Now, it says here the disciples. Disciples is what the earliest followers of Jesus called themselves. That's how they refer to themselves. What are you? Who are you? I'm a disciple of Jesus. Now, it's at Antioch that these disciples are first called Christians, which I think is interesting. Because what the wording of this statement implies is that they didn't call themselves Christians, other people called them Christians. That the people in Antioch looked at this group of people and said, everything these people do, everything they talk about, the way they live, they're obsessed with Christ. Christ is a title that was used to talk about Jesus. They're obsessed with Christ. They're just little Christians is what they are. So it's this name that recognizes that everything about them centers around Jesus Christ. And so now this is the first place where Christian shows up. It's in Antioch. And again, like I said, Antioch becomes the first church to send people out on missionary journeys throughout the Roman Empire to go tell other people about Jesus, to start new churches. And we're told about 3 journeys specifically that the Apostle Paul makes throughout the book of Acts. And here's kind of a map that highlights some of his journeys. I don't know if you can see it really well, but if you Google a map, you can see it. But Paul's first journey kind of just takes him in this part. His second and third journeys go way throughout the empire. Eventually, this last one, he'll sail all the way to Rome. That's not technically a journey. He's actually under arrest going there for trial. But Paul travels all over the Roman Empire. And everywhere he goes, he talks to people about Jesus. He starts new churches. Someplace Paul goes to, there's already churches there. And he just kind of spends time encouraging them and building them up. But Paul takes these 3 journeys between the year 47 and 56 CE. So by the time you get to the year 56 CE, there are now churches and followers of Jesus and Christians all over the Roman Empire. This thing is spread kind of all over the place. Now, this creates a very interesting dilemma for Christianity at this point, because now there's a lot of tension that emerges between Christianity and between Rome. See, early on, the tension that Christianity felt was between Judaism and Christianity, because they were centered down here in Jerusalem. But now that they've spread, now they've come into contact with Roman culture. And see, the thing about Roman culture is Rome has its own religious system, religious institution. And within the Roman religious practice, there's all kinds of gods and goddesses, but the center of Roman worship is worshiping the emperor. You would worship the emperor, whoever the emperor happened to be, as divine. The emperor was considered a god. And within the Roman religious system, as long as you worshiped the emperor, you were more than willing to worship whatever other gods or goddesses you wanted to. You could add whatever you wanted, nobody cared. As long as you participated in the corporate, let's worship the emperor and let's recognize that our emperor, our leader, is a god and is divine. Now this creates problems with both Judaism and Christianity, because both Judaism and Christianity forbid that. I mean, the central creed of both Judaism and Christianity is there is one God, and we only worship that God. Now, in the first century Roman world, the difference between Judaism and Christianity is that a long time before this, Julius Caesar, who's kind of the founder really in a lot of ways of the Roman Empire, Julius Caesar has legalized Judaism. So Judaism is a legal religion within the Roman Empire. Christianity is not. So as long as Christianity was a part of Judaism, it was protected by Roman law because Julius Caesar, the founder, had legalized it. But when Christianity emerges as its own thing and it becomes known as the Way and they become known as Christians, now they are illegal. They're not protected. And so kind of starting in the latter half of the first century, Christianity becomes an easy target for Roman emperors. They are this distinct, unprotected group. There's a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus who writes about how Nero, and Nero was the emperor of Rome from 54 to 68. How at one point Nero starts a fire in the city of Rome, burns down a big chunk of the city. He does it for political reasons. People get all upset about him. And so what Nero does is Nero, in order to shift the focus away from himself, he blames the Christians and begins this intense persecution. And here's what Tacitus writes about this. Consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate. And a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome. And so Tacitus, who has no love for Christians at all, is writing and he says, listen, this is who Nero blamed, and this is who Nero started persecuting. And Nero's persecution was brutal. I mean, he would burn Christians, he would kill them. It was harsh. Now, if you go on to read Tacitus, Tacitus will actually talk about how Christians were found guilty of hating people and they were killed. So again, beginning in Nero, whose reign starts in, like I said, I think it's 54, persecution happens within the Roman Empire and it's targeted at churches. Now, it doesn't happen all the time. But in these early centuries, when Christianity is underneath the Roman Empire, there's kind of this on-again, off-again persecution that's a constant reality for the earliest Christians. After Nero, Domitian, who was a guy who reigned from 89 to 96, Emperor Domitian, he persecutes Christians. Trajan ruled from 98 to 117, and he persecuted Christians. There's a letter that we have from a governor, a Roman governor in Turkey named Pliny the Younger. And he writes this letter to Emperor Trajan, asking him for advice on how to deal with the growing Christian problem. And here's part of the letter that he writes, which is interesting. He's writing to the emperor and he says, having never been present at any trials of the Christians, I'm unacquainted with the methods and limits to be observed in either examining them or punishing them. For the matter seemed to me well worth referring to you, especially considered the numbers endangered. Many persons of all ages and ranks and both sexes are being called and will be called to trial. For this contagious superstition is not confined only to the cities, but has also spread through the villages and rural districts. And so Pliny the Younger is writing to the emperor saying, hey, I'm kind of new to this whole thing. You have experience. How do you deal with these people? How do you deal with this growing problem, this superstition? And what Pliny highlights is, man, this thing's gone all over the place. Men, women, every class, every rank, it's all over the place. So even though Christianity, the early church, the earliest Christians, even though they're facing all this kinds of persecution, they're still growing and they're still expanding. But they continue to face persecution. In 250, another big persecution breaks out. In 257, Emperor Valerian ordered the death of a lot of high-ranking church officials. In 303, Emperor Diocletian persecutes Christians. And so again, while it's not a constant reality through these earliest centuries, the reality is that the earliest Christians, the earliest church, they faced persecution on again, off again, all the time. It was a constant fear they lived with, where they were targeted by national and by local Roman government officials. And they were beat, they were thrown in jail, they were killed. And these sporadic persecutions happen until the year 313, when Constantine issues an edict that legalizes Christianity. It's called the Edict of Milan. In 313, Constantine legalizes Christianity in the Roman Empire. And at that point, everything changes. Constantine is considered to be the first Christian emperor. There's people that will, depending on what scholars you read, will debate whether how sincere it was. But historically, he's the one who legalizes Christianity. And at that point, that's when all of these previous persecutions stop. Now, what's fascinating, is we've talked about this a little bit, is when you look at the story of the early church throughout these early centuries, that yeah, persecution is one of the themes of the church, but also growth and expansion are one of the themes. That right alongside the persecution, even as the church faces persecution, they're constantly growing and expanding. Rodney Stark, who is a researcher and a professor at Baylor University, he estimates that based on the evidence that we have, that during these early centuries, Christianity grew at a rate of 3.4% per year, or 40% per decade. Here's a chart of growth that Stark has in one of his books that's called The Rise of Christianity. And he charts by year and the number of Christians and the percent of the population. And you can see that, yeah, it starts off, like we said, it starts off near 40, about 1,000 people. And those early years must have seemed kind of tough going because you don't get a lot of people. Going from 1,000 to 1,400 doesn't seem like that big of a number. But again, constant, percentage growth adds up over time. And so by the time you get to like Constantine, by the time the empire becomes Christian, it's already a majority of the population. And so even as they're facing all of this persecution and all of this expansion, they're still growing. They're still becoming the dominant movement within the empire. And we have evidence of this because the last persecution I talked about, the one that Diocletian starts up, that persecution actually has to be cut off because there's already the reality that Christianity is too widespread. That there's nothing we can do about it at this point. There's so many people who are already a part of this. There's nothing we can do about it, so we just need to stop. Now, what's really interesting is what happens now from this point on out. Because at this point, everything changes for Christianity. Because here's the reality. During the first few hundred years of Christianity, during these first early centuries, the church has no social or political power at all. They have none whatsoever. They are a targeted, persecuted movement. But that all changes starting in 313. If you skip ahead now to 380, the Edict of Thessalonica is issued. The Edict of Thessalonica is actually what converts the empire to Christianity. So now at this point, a powerless, persecuted movement has ultimately overcome and conquered the empire. And what I want us to understand is the early Christians did that with no political or social power at all whatsoever. They had none. But now with the Edict of Milan and the Edict of Thessalonica and the conversion of the empire to Christianity, now for the first time within the Roman system, the church actually has political and social power. This is when you start to see the rise of the Bishop of Rome. And the Bishop of Rome ultimately becomes the Pope, and you begin to see papal authority. In the late 400s, there's a pope by the name of Gelasius I, and he articulates this theory of power about there being two swords. One is known as the temporal sword, which would be like the state. The other is the spiritual sword, which would be the church. And what he argues is that you have these two sources of power within the world. And so now for the first time, you have this argument that the church carries all of this power, which is fascinating to me that you know the church claimed to get its power and authority from Jesus. And they talked about their power as being a sword, which Jesus, as much as his followers asked him to take out a sword and fight, refused to. But that was the metaphor they took, that we wield this spiritual sword that has all of this power and authority over the world around us. As the Western Roman Empire falls, popes make all kinds of concessions to temporal powers, to kings, to monarchs, to leaders, in order to remain protected. And so what happens at this point now is the church becomes incredibly political. It becomes interweaved with all of the different kings and monarchs and nations around them. In the mid-700s, the papal states are established, and these are church-controlled lands. And so now you have the church that's actually ruling geographic political areas. In the year 800, you have this interesting thing where Pope Leo III crowns Charlemagne the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And what happens after that point is basically what Pope Leo says is, because I crowned Charlemagne, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, that proves that ultimately the temporal powers, the temporal sword, only gets its power from the spiritual sword. And so it's this way of claiming that actually the church, Christianity, has more power than even the king or the emperor or any other political power. In the year 1049, there's a huge controversy between the sitting pope and the king of Germany over who really controls the clergy. It's known as the Investiture Controversy, and they have this big battle over who controls the clergy, because then who ultimately controls the people. And it's literally the church and the state fighting for control and power. In 1095, the First Crusade is launched by Pope Urban II. In the 12th century, the office of the Pope becomes heavily administrative, it becomes bureaucratic, it becomes legal. I mean, in a lot of ways, Rome is seen as like the ultimate, like almost like we would see the Supreme Court. And what's fascinating, this is really, really interesting, is from that point on, so from the 12th century on, very few popes are listed as saints. Because prior to that, their jobs were more spiritual, and it was more shepherding. But from that point on, it becomes pretty much almost all political for the most part. The church continued to be involved in politics and wars and crusades and land disputes and punishing heretics. You look at the 13th century Inquisition. During the Renaissance, popes were far more involved in politics and finances and less in spiritual matters. And all of that ultimately leads to the 16th century Reformation. Now again, there was a lot of names in there, there was a lot of dates, and I don't expect you to remember it all, but here's the point that I want us to understand. That beginning with Constantine, and with the conversion of the Roman Empire, and when Christianity shifts from being this powerless movement, essentially, this social political powerless movement, to being a politically powerful entity, here's what happens within the church. The political power became a substitute for sacrificial love. See, the early church, the earliest Christians, they faced constant persecution. They didn't have anyone to protect them. They didn't have anyone to watch out for them. They didn't have a big army. They didn't have elected political leaders who could stand up for them. All they had was their trust and their hope in Jesus and their belief that sacrificial love was the most powerful force on the planet. And it was through sacrificial love that God was making the world new and ultimately saving creation. And they were convinced that if they lived lives of sacrificial love like they saw in Jesus, that they could change their world. And they did. We saw that. They overcame the Roman Empire. But beginning with Constantine, what the church found is that it's much easier to rely on political power to change the world than it is sacrificial love. Because sacrificial love has a cost to it. Sacrificial love has a price to it. See, if we just hold on to political power, we can make things the way that we want them to be, and it doesn't cost us anything. Now, I want to be very clear on this. It's not that the church had no power at all. They did. They did. Here's what Paul writes in 2 Timothy 1:7. He says this. He says, "For the Spirit God gives us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline." See, they had power. It just wasn't what you and I typically think of when we think of power. It wasn't control. It wasn't authority. What they had was the power of God that was alive inside of them. That's what the Spirit is, the presence of God that's alive inside of them. And they lived lives that were fueled by the power of sacrificial love. And the reason we know sacrificial love is powerful, we don't think of it as powerful because, again, when we think of power, we think of military might and strength and imposing our will on someone else. But what the early Christians proved is that with sacrificial love, you can change an empire. Because they did. See, what we're going to spend the next several weeks talking about is we're going to spend the next several weeks talking about the kinds of power that the early church used to turn their world upside down. Because what we want to do is we want to recover what it really means to be a Christian, what it really means to follower of Jesus. We want to uncover the power of sacrificial love that these earliest Christians used to turn their world upside down. Because what has happened, beginning with Constantine and throughout then, is Christians, including us, have tended to substitute political power for sacrificial love. And we've rested on rules and authorities to do everything so that we wouldn't have to. And so what we want to do is we want to go back and look at when Paul says power, when Paul says there was power, when we talk about the power of sacrificial love, what is that? What is it that drove the early church to lead them to overcome so much, even in the face of such intense opposition? Now, as we talk through this, I just want to give you this warning right up front. As we talk through this, in some ways, this is going to be a critique of how later Christians, including us, have substituted political power for sacrificial love. But my point is not to point fingers. My point is not to make anyone feel guilty. Let me make this very clear. I'm not saying there's anything inherently evil or wrong with politics. I hope that we have good Christian men and women who serve within politics, who serve on city councils and state legislatures and governors and senators and congresspeople and presidents all over the world. We need good Christian people in all of those. My point is that not these things are evil or they're horrible. I'm not asking us to just not have anything to do with politics. My point is this, that the earliest church was driven by their hope in Jesus Christ alone. That's the point. That we don't find our hope in politics. We don't find our hope in power. We don't find our hope in authority. We find our hope in Jesus Christ and in his death and resurrection. That's what drove the early church. And if you and I want to live with that same kind of conviction, with that same kind of passion, if you and I want to make the impact in our world that the earliest church made in theirs, then we have to recover the power of sacrificial love. We have to recover the power of the Spirit. We have to recover the power that drove the church to turn their world upside down. And it all starts with making sure that our hope rests in Jesus and Jesus alone. Let me pray. Father, I thank you so much for your love for us. I thank you for everything that you have given to us. I thank you that you came to this earth and you died and rose again so that we could be free, so that we could have hope. And God, I know in our life we put our hope in so many different things. Sometimes we put it in power, sometimes we put it in money, sometimes we put it in status and popularity. But Father, the reality is those things, Paul talks about all those things are dying. They're all temporary. God, help us to put our hope in you and to know that no matter what's happening in our life, no matter what's happening in our world, God, our hope is in you and the power of the cross. the power of sacrificial love, that you gave yourself away for our benefit. And it's through sacrificial love that you are changing the world and you are saving the world. And God, it is through sacrificial love that you will change our lives and our families and our cities and our state and our nation and our world. And God, above everything else, as a church, as followers of Jesus, we want to recover what the early church had. We want to live with that same passion, that same boldness, that same sense of hope. Because God, we so want to turn our world upside down. Father, we love you, we thank you, we pray all of this in Jesus' name.